Formula 1 in 2022 has arrived, and we've had the first 3 days of testing for this new era of F1. And despite the coverage not being shown on TV, there was a lot to talk about. So here's my 5 things we learned from the Barcelona test. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Formula 1 broadcast decisions. The first box of the season for me has got to be an amber box for Formula 1, as they decided that the first test of the year would be held behind closed doors, or at least sort of held behind closed doors, as the testing would not be televised. We were also told that live timing would not be shared, but the timing screens were active and we received that information. For me, this warrants an amber box rather than a red box because actually the coverage was better than I had expected. There was some excellent work from the media teams on the ground to provide the latest insights based on what they could see. But at the same time, this test, and I will continue to call it a test, was the first running beyond private team shakedowns for these new cars. And that's such an exciting time for the sport, off the back of one of the most exciting seasons the sport has seen in years. The appetite for these new cars is palpable within the F1 fanbase, and so getting this sort of semi-broadcast where you have the media sharing live updates but no live television broadcast or fans at the event is very disappointing. We all know the most likely factor as to why this decision was taken. It was probably a decision that was taken due to money. The testing in a couple of weeks' time in Bahrain is going to be broadcast with the fans allowed to attend. And so there's probably some form of payment from that government or the track to ensure that they have the exclusive rights to the first live TV pictures of these new cars. Formula 1 did say that this would be a shakedown and that they wanted to avoid the teams having the potential embarrassment of cars breaking down with the fact that the power units will have been repackaged as part of these new aerodynamic regulations. We've seen that there were a few breakdowns with various problems over the 3 days of running, but that's nothing out of the ordinary. There are always problems that teams have faced, and there's one new one in particular that's emerged from this 3-day test, which we'll certainly get to later in this video. Overall then, it's the amber box for Formula 1 for keeping this event private. But before I share my thoughts on the testing itself, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I'll be sharing my 5 things we learned after every race this season, and I'll be making videos on any other major talking points for the 2022 season. New driving styles required. Next up is a green box for the new driving styles that the drivers are going to potentially have to adopt with this new era of Formula 1. With most of the downforce coming from the ground effect, there's a desire for the teams to keep the cars as flat as possible. This is the goal because there will be a reduction in downforce if any air leaks out of the side of the floor. It's a challenge for all teams as they develop the majority of their downforce from the Venturi tunnels underneath the cars. What this means in practice though is that the drivers will want to keep the floor as flat as possible in order to maintain this. So being aggressive into the corners is potentially less lucrative than it has been in previous aerodynamic eras. One driver in particular that's been noted as having made a change to his driving style is Max Verstappen. Verstappen's been known as having one of the most aggressive driving styles on the grid, but according to reports that I've seen at least, it seems like he's adopted a smoother driving style to keep his Red Bull car as level as possible through the corners. This is a particularly impressive point for me. I think that this change shows just how talented Verstappen is. He's a driver that has the foresight to look at and understand exactly how his car works and how it produces the downforce. This new aerodynamic era is what will define Verstappen's Formula 1 career, as he'll want to add more championships to his name. Without being able to watch the drivers on track, it's difficult to know if any others are doing the same, and I'm sure there are drivers adopting similar styles to ensure they maximise the performance from their cars. Likewise, it could well be the case that the Red Bull demands this driving style from its drivers more than some of the other cars, but given the principles of keeping the floor as close to the ground as possible and keeping the air underneath the floor, it's probably necessary for all teams. It'll be interesting to see how this develops as we get into the next test. By that time, the drivers may have had more time to practice adjusting their driving style in the simulator, a safe environment where a mistake would not be punished quite so harshly, so we could find that other drivers follow Verstappen in this approach. Changing driving styles is an exciting prospect, and certainly something that means the drivers, as well as the car designers, are being challenged in this new era. Haas, a tough start. Next up, I'm going to talk about Haas. The Haas team took a gamble on this new era, almost exclusively putting their development time into their 2022 Challenger throughout 2021. And as a result, their car looks to be the most developed on the grid, And by that, I don't mean that the Haas will be the fastest car, but it looks like they've spent more time adding the finishing touches to their car with winglets and changes to the front wing that we could well see other teams adopt throughout the rest of the season. It's an exciting time for Haas, but it's impossible to talk about this team without talking about their title sponsor, Uralkali, a Russian firm that's potentially integral to the running of the Haas team. Going into day 3, the team removed Uralkali's name from their car and the Russian flags from their livery. I believe this was the right thing to do, and I'm impressed by the team's swift action to remove that sponsor from their car. What this means for Haas for the rest of this season is not yet known. Gunther Steiner has told Sky that they are not dependent on the funding from the sponsor, but this has got to be a doubt given their dependency on title sponsors in the past and the previous reluctance of the team's owner Gene Haas to invest any more money into the team. There's also, of course, the challenge of Nikita Mazepin, who is associated with that backing. Will he be able to stay in that seat, given the changes? Time will tell on that one, as this continues to be a constantly changing situation. But for me, I'm going to give a green box to Haas, who've done an excellent job through the season in developing a car that, although hasn't been too reliable, it has looked exciting and might not be the worst out there this year. Bouncing. The next point I want to talk about is a problem that all of the teams seem to be faced with given the new aerodynamic regulations, and that is the new bouncing or porpoising, which is impacting the cars with these new regulations. When running down the straight at high speed, the cars seem to drop down and potentially lose downforce as the floor touches the track. This subsequent loss of downforce brings the car back up again, and then the downforce that comes back with that rising ride height causes the cycle to begin again. It's a problem for all teams, with some teams that are impacted more than others. In particular, the Haas teams running on their first day of testing was heavily impacted by a damaged floor, and it seems like the Mercedes and Alfa Romeo teams could well be suffering as well. Of course, the teams will be focused on finding solutions to this problem, making some tweaks to their ride height and their wing angles to avoid this. But, as Formula 1 goes to different circuits, that will be very different when it comes to things like undulation. We could well find that some of the teams end up on the back foot at certain races if they don't get on top of this quickly. It's one of the quirks of this new F1 era, and I for one am massively excited to see how the teams, and maybe even the FIA, make changes to help the teams out with it. It's a new issue, and is one of the reasons why the new regulations in Formula 1 make things particularly exciting. And it's certainly one of the things to look out for in the Bahrain test in a couple of weeks' time. The most running time goes to. Now, everyone always says that you should not read anything into the time set in testing, so my final point in this video, I'm going to look at the amount of running time that each of the teams have achieved. The reason running time tends to be a good benchmark for performance is because it means that out of the box the teams have a reliable car, and that in turn means that they'll have more data from their extra running. It's a massive bonus for these teams and will mean that they can iron out any initial problems with their new cars. And this year, at the Barcelona test, the team with the most running was Ferrari, with 439 laps. Hence that team is taking the green box for me, at least for this first test. It was a good test for the Italian team, as they showed off their interesting looking side pods, which seemed to resemble a dented ping pong ball. But with a power unit that seems to be producing even more power and a radical design, they seem to have a reliable car that, according to some of the other teams, is also very fast. But as I've already mentioned, times are variable, given the different fuel loads and testing schedules. The next few teams in the list when it comes to mileage include Mercedes, McLaren, Red Bull and Williams, so some expected names when it comes to the running time at the top, and the likely outcome will be that these teams will be able to get further into their testing schedules and try out more and more setups that start to unlock more performance for these teams once they get to qualifying in Bahrain. However, when it comes to the worst performances in terms of mileage, there are two teams that stand out. These being Alfa Romeo with 175 laps and Haas with just 160. These teams seem to have more issues than the others when it comes to the bouncing, as I've already mentioned, but both teams have faced a number of other issues as well, and I'm sure they'll be looking to resolve that before the next test. So that's my thoughts on the first 3-day test of the 2022 season. There are of course many other talking points that I missed, so let me know what you learned from the first Barcelona test in the comments.